Can you guys see my screen? Just like give me a little thumbs up in the bottom. Great. Okay, excellent. Okay, well, thank you everyone for coming today. So glad to be here with you all and make little avatars together. So the topic of the talk that I'm going to give today is getting started with UX research and a little bit about why it helps in product design. And before we get into the thick of it, I'm just going to introduce myself again. I don't know, in case you didn't quite catch. So thank you, Jising, for introducing me just now. But yeah, hi, I'm Mabel. I'm a UX researcher at Stampede Design. A bunch of my colleagues are here. They'll wave at you in the Figma room. I was previously a product manager at VLT Labs, Brands and Sequence, which was my own company, Sequence. But I always did research at each of those jobs, and it was always something I enjoyed a lot. And I'm so lucky to finally be part of a team where I can do that all the time. Subplot, I like making dumplings, but it's been reiterated. As you can see, there's a little picture here of me cooking the dumplings. So I'm sure everyone loves dumplings. We can meet up and make them together one day. Okay, so let's get into it. I'm going to start the next bit. This is a very interesting setup. Okay, I'm ready. All right, so I'm going to get into the main bit of the show. Here we go. So let's start. Okay, we're going to talk about UX research and how to get going in it. Okay, so first and foremost, what is UX research? I'm sure a lot of you here, since you're probably into Figma, you're probably into product design, you've heard a bit about it here and there. Maybe some of you even work a little bit in this area. But just to summarize, simply put, user research is just asking questions to people to better understand their experience and their needs. In a more defined way of explaining user experience is that user experience research is the systematic process of investigating and understanding user behaviors. So how people do things, what they need, and what their motivations are. So the why people choose to do a certain thing. And we understand this through observation techniques, task analysis, and other feedback methodologies, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. All right. Okay, so why do UX research? I think many times you'll hear this question if you're working for a company, like, why do we need to do UX research? I know my customer, I know what they need, I don't need to check. Maybe you do know what they need, but there are things that maybe you just can't see, right? User research helps us to understand the user better, and understanding the user better means building better products that serve the user's needs. So it's about building the right product before building the product right. Like if you have a target of like students, but you make them a chainsaw, you know, maybe it's not the right product, but you're like already refining the chainsaw. It just doesn't make sense. Okay. And the third thing is when you do user research, as you're going through the process, like ideations and solutions become more obvious when you have identified the problem. Like speaking to users helps you to clarify what assumptions you've made and where you can actually have impact in improving their user experience. So you're not just making things that you think that will help fix the issue. You find out from them what the issue exactly is, and then you go from there. And finally, user research also helps you to focus your design and development effort. It limits the scope to only what is most important and most critical to your target user. So yeah, I think all these are good reasons to explore user research, and they help you ground your design decision-making process later on. For yourself or for your team, if you're part of a team. Okay, so all good. So that's a little bit about the why. The majority of this talk will be about how do I get started, okay? Because I think when I was starting user research, I was seeing and hearing a lot of theory, and I was like finding it very hard to compile what are the basics I needed to get going. So that's what we'll cover today. All right? Okay. So here's what we'll cover today. This lovely lady is illustrating reading. We're gonna talk a little bit about the components of research. So one of them is having a research plan. And then we're going to talk a bit about research methods, broad strokes about what methods there are and what you might use. Oops, recruiting participants, because you need to have participants to do research. Otherwise, you can't really call it research. And pilot study, what that is and why it's important. Conducting the actual research itself and what that means for you as maybe the interviewer or the researcher. How to take notes, very important. It doesn't seem that important, but it's extremely important how you take notes. And how to do processing your notes so you can get information out of the research you've done. And then finally, sharing your findings and recommendations with your team or your stakeholders. All right. So let's get into it. I'm going to start with the first one, which is the research plan. So this is a research plan. Okay, it's just a sample. Not all research plans look like this. A research plan is simply a document where you record the plan for yourself and for the team you're working with. It can be done on Word, Docs, or Notion. It can be anywhere. It's simply a way to keep track of and communicate your plan. It doesn't have to be overly complex. And you can do it pretty much quickly, and it's a document that evolves as you go along with your project. Like, you don't write it on the first day and you're like, damn, golden research plan that I never touch again. It's something that as the situation changes in your project, you adjust and so on. So here's a little bit what goes into a research plan, just as an example. It doesn't always have to be the same, but like a background of the project. So, who commissioned the research or why you want to do the research, like you saw the opportunity that you want to explore, your research goal, what you want to find out, your research objectives, like so the goal and objective are very close, but goal is more like maybe the business impact, and the objective is like what you want to find out exactly in your research plan. The question and hypothesis. So research question and hypothesis is important because if you start the process of researching without actually having the overarching question in mind, you might try to answer too many questions, which can happen often in like when you're going through many projects. Participants and schedule, if applicable. Software, so maybe you're using Zoom, maybe you're using Teams, you got links, you got boards, just put everything in. The methodology you want to use, which is just a fancy way of saying I want to do it like this. The test structure, so like just saying I'm going to do this first and then I'm going to do that. A test script if you're doing an in-depth interview, so it will help you prepare what to say to your participant. And yeah, so that's just one simple example. And you can get this example from this website called 0-2x.com or his YouTube channel. Just look it up. And there are many templates online that you can refer to, and no one template is the same. The important thing is to keep track of your work, basically. And with time and experience, you may feel like you don't need to do this anymore. But I think I would encourage you to resist the urge to skip this step, because it helps you keep track, and it helps your team keep track, and it helps structure your thinking. Yeah, so that's it for research plan. If you have any questions later, we'll do it in Q&A, or you can put it in the chat, and I'll try to answer a bit later on. All right, so we're going on to research methods. So seems very complex. Okay, research methods. So here on your left, we have exploratory methods. and we have evaluative methods. These type of methods just indicate where you're most likely to use them in the product design and development cycle. You don't really have to remember the names because the naming is not that important. It's more that you apply them. So most generative research or exploratory research happens in the early stage of the product development cycle, where you don't have a lot of information about the landscape you want to explore. So you conduct maybe some simple research interviews to understand and inform, to understand the persona user and inform the project and the product prioritization. And then on the other hand, you have evaluative research, which typically happens to assess like a potential solution or idea once it's been designed. So you've done your mock-up, you want to check if it makes sense, you do usability testing, for example. So I just want to emphasize, like, research methods, you don't have to know all the methods to start doing research. Most of the research you do will do are probably going to use these 4 quite simple methods. So in-depth interviews, which is just interviews that are conducted with a participant. You ask them loads of questions, you investigate, and you try to understand what they want in a conversation format. Contextual inquiry or field study is just when you follow someone around in their environment and you try to figure out, you observe them and you see, okay, he picked up his phone at this time of day because it's lunchtime. That's the kind of thing that contextual study is about. And then usability testing, it can be you observing a user use the product you made, of course. And then survey, everyone knows survey, right? It's just a list of questions that are formatted in a certain way, and you answer them. And so these are the most common methods. And if you're just starting out, I recommend that you start here. Yeah. Great comments. I will hopefully try to be able to read them all later. But thanks, guys. All right. So the next bit about research methods is that you might want to know is another type, a way of categorizing research methods. So you have qualitative and you have quantitative. And I just want to say up front that there's no better method. There's no best method. You should apply the research method that works for the goal that you're trying to achieve based on your research plan and your research objectives. Okay, and the simple difference between qualitative and quantitative, I think a lot of you might have learned this at school. Quantitative is when you have more numerical data, volume of participants, volume of responses, and everything is more based on statistics, the outcomes. And qualitative is when you are more focused on deep diving into certain areas of interest to paint a picture of what their experience is. Okay. And again, like before, the main methods that you will probably end up using are in-depth interviews, usability testing, surveys, things like that. Okay. So I think the main thing, just to conclude the section about method, is that you can always read more online. There's like infinite resources of methodologies. The important thing is to start with the simple ones, and it never has to be overly complicated. And as you become more experienced and you try the methods out, you will understand like the pros and cons of each, and then it will make it easier for you to choose the methods later on. But as a start, just stick with, you know, the main couple of methods. Okay, so beyond research methodologies, so touch a little bit on this, is building up skills in other areas, so that building up skills in other areas actually can greatly impact the quality and outcome of your research, because it shapes how you ask questions, it shapes how you frame your entire research, and it shapes how you interact with others. So I would say, as you're exploring research, these are other things that you can hone as well in tandem. So having some UX and design knowledge, so having a good context and understanding of, you know, principles that do apply. product thinking, like developing the understanding of the business impact to the product and what issues are most relevant. Because in research, you'll get all sorts of signals, and you don't really need to tell your product team like all the random signals. You need to focus on the main ones that are relevant to the product. Communication skills. So I think it's something I'm working on as well. I find it challenging, but being able to effectively communicate and present your research findings is super important, because you could have the best research ever, but if it doesn't communicate and to the stakeholders, if it doesn't click, then it may feel a bit like you couldn't quite get what you wanted to get out of it. You might not be able to influence the product strategy as much as you want. And finally, collaboration skills. So being able to work with others and create shared ownership of the research. So I think as a user, if you start in user research and as a user researcher, you don't want to sit in your ivory tower with all your like hoarding the info and doling it out like a king. You want to share the info. You want to make sure everyone feels like they can use the info for their design, for their business decision, and so on. All right. So moving on to the next part. Of course, if you want to conduct your research, you need to have participants. So recruiting needs to be done based on your research goal. So you find out from your stakeholders, maybe in a workshop or a design sprint, like which groups they want to learn about and why. And then the participant criteria will help you to understand who you want to speak to. So, you create a simple persona to begin with, so you can start mapping out your participant criteria. And it can look very simple, something like with the age, the gender, the occupation, the location, and then criteria like they must use at least one food delivery app. They must use at least one mobile phone, something like this. And this is how you scope who you're going to speak to. Okay. Okay, moving on. So once you have an idea of who you want to target for your participants, you're thinking, how many people should I actually speak to? Like, do I need to speak to 100 people to like get the answers I want? Thankfully, the answer is no. Sample size is something you can read about for more in-depth understanding, but as a rule of thumb, yes, these are magnificent ducks. As a rule of thumb, 5 people will suffice for a simple qualitative study. Of course, if you're doing a quantitative study, you can spam like way more people, but for like qualitative studies like user interviews or usability testing, 5 will suffice. The main reason is that I think the benchmark to cover all potential issues like 15 people, and 5 you get most of the way there, like 75% accuracy. And so the main reason you should maybe go with 4 or 5 people is that you distribute your budget better. You don't blow all your money on one massive survey or massive study, sorry, and you are able to, bisect your budget. And it's also more manageable to speak to 5 people. You will still get a reasonably valid outcome and finding. So maybe the only time where you may want to, expand or test more users is maybe if you have multiple personas for the study. So in that case, maybe you do maybe 4 or 5 participants per persona. But really, it depends on your research goal. And I highly encourage you to read more about it because it's quite interesting as well. Just some like statistical stuff that may interest you. Okay. So the next bit is about conducting. So once you have all your participants, you've got a research plan sorted. Now it's about you're ready to go. But before you get going, you need to conduct a pilot study. So you don't want to like plan everything and then just jump straight into your first interview without any practice, because it can be a little tricky. Yeah. Conducting interviews and USB tests seem easy, but it does take a bit of practice to get used to. So what happens in a pilot study? One, you simulate a real test session or a real interview. The second is, as you're doing that, you and your team are checking for areas of improvement in your questions and setup. So maybe your camera is like not bright enough, the user can't see you. And then you make changes, you fix typos, you rephrase questions, you adjust the flow, you practice your script, you tweak the note-taking structure, make sure everything's in order. And it seems a bit banal, like it seems like really like boring stuff, but I promise you, being prepared for things like logistics will make your life easier. Giving you, for example, even giving users a little guide of what they should do to prepare before coming to the study is helpful. I know one guy, he showed up in his underwear once. Like he stood up and we saw his underpants. It's a real story. You can ask Chising or Adil. I think he was there. Yeah. So yeah, be prepared, practice, and then your interview sessions will go smoothly. So, so when you've done your yes, she's saying what? Hold up. When you've done your pilot study, it's time to conduct the research. All right. So it's time. You've done all the prep work. You sort out your pilot. You told everyone to wear pants to the research study. You're ready to go. If you're conducting a usability test or an in-depth interview, chances are you'll be in a setup that is sort of similar to this. In this case, this is a usability test. A user interview would be more like they sit facing each other, and there's a note taker in the corner. However, since we're in a time of COVID, you're more likely to be in a Zoom call. And frankly, this can work just as well and maybe even better for note taking. With our team, Stampede, we've done usability tests, used so many usability tests and so many user interviews over Zoom now. It's like we've kind of refined the process as we've gone along. And it really does work. So there's no limit to whether you're physically there or you're there digitally. You can conduct user research. And this is really good news because I saw someone had questions. Convinced. I think sometimes the prohibition from maybe managers is like budget, and when you can do things like online research, it can greatly reduce the budget and maybe help you convince your manager or your team that it's a good idea to at least try a small one. So when you're conducting the research, there are usually three main players: you, the interviewer, your colleague, the note taker, and obviously, most importantly, the participant. How do you, yes, but that's a good question. How do you convince your volunteers to conduct your research? So if there's many types of research. So if you're surveying, maybe you have a data set of people that you can send a bunch of surveys to, good for you. If you're just starting out, maybe you only have your colleagues. I think that's what they call guerrilla testing or Starbucks testing. You just grab anyone in your office, and that's free, of course. But obviously, the people in your office are not your persona. So there's a trade-off on the accuracy of the information. Often what we do for Stampede is, well, in most cases, in most professional settings, you do provide an incentive, whether monetary or a voucher, as a thank you to the participant for their time. It can be something small, it can be something big. It really depends on your budget. But what I can recommend if you don't have a budget is that often people are okay to do it for free, but of course you don't abuse their time and you make the experience very pleasant for them. Or if your budget is small, even though what you're offering is not that big, if you again, make it a pleasant experience and make it feel like they contributed something. Usually most participants are fine. Yeah, but when you get to like bigger research, longer studies, you usually have to compensate more. So it really depends the size of your research and who you're targeting. Yeah. Okay, one more question for conducting the research. I think Adil's got a good question. So how to conduct a user interview that has multiple sub-personas, and can we group them into one persona? So this goes back a bit to just now the sample size question. If the sub-personas are similar enough, right, then maybe you can group them. But if you're seeing that the sub-personas are significantly, like, have strong differences, then I think it's worthwhile to explore having like 5 each. And you basically set up similar questions to see, so that you can see the differences across personas. Yeah. If they're similar enough, you could group them into one persona. It really depends what criteria you're looking for in your research. Yeah. Hope that answers your question. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next bit. So when you're conducting research, you have to kind of put on your researcher hat. You're like, I'm a researcher now. And then other days you're like, I'm a designer. Today I'm a researcher. So research is not just about watching mindlessly while the user speaks, like not just saying like, yeah, okay, cool. Like you're just pressing the buttons. I know which button you press. It's more about, it's really important to engage with the person who's in conversation before you. And it's also respect. It's their time, it's your time, it's your colleague's time. You want to make the most out of these sessions. And so what you should do when you're in researcher mode is to engage all your senses and brain power when interviewing, so you can get the most out of the limited time you spend with each person. I really think active listening is very important, and if you want to be doing user research. Active listening is not just hearing, it's understanding what people are saying as they go along, while being empathetic, understanding why they're saying things, understanding where they're coming from, understanding their motivations, like really tuning into like what moves them as a user for your product. And then also being curious and inquisitive and like keen-eyed, like, with empathy and with active listening, you should be able to pick up, or with time and with practice, you should be able to pick up like little things that spark your interest. You're like, oh, that's an interesting point. I'm going to follow it and see where it takes me, especially in in-depth interviews where it's less structured than a usability test, for example. You can really dig into why they think a certain thing. So I think these are attributes that are really important. And then related to researcher mode, I see a question from Nisha, which is like, how do you move the user along without prompting them? I think this is a really good question. It is challenging sometimes, like, but a lot of tips that I get is to keep the momentum in your tone, like because you are the sort of facilitator of the room. Your tone and your pace should like enliven the participant. If like the participant's like, passing out, then you need to like bring the energy and like, try to push them along and engage them. Yeah. And it's a lot of practice, but you'll get it, I'm sure. Okay, so moving on to the next bit. Okay, all the fun stuff, note-taking. I know it sounds boring, but it's not. It's really important, and it really impacts your workload. So, and the quality of your research. So it really depends. You have to decide for yourself based on your research method, what style of notes suits the information you're getting, and also take into consideration how much time you have to process and synthesize your notes, right? you can have the recording. I mean, we all record our interviews, but I think no one really wants to spend 10 hours like watching back user data, user speaking. What I recommend is to like use timestamps and stuff like that. So these are different types of note-taking methods. You know, you have structured notes. So maybe you like things to be very like specific. So you block out everything you want to ask, and then you make sure you fill out every box, and then you have all your things like structured as you go along. You have unstructured notes where it's basically just free writing or free typing. You know, maybe you're writing verbatim for the whole thing, although like in that case, like you may have a lot of things to parse later on when you're synthesizing your notes. Or you have semi-structured notes where you have some like idea you want to color code things as they speak, or some, you know, labels as they speak, you write them, and then others it's like free format. So it's really up to you and what you're comfortable with, and what also works best for the method that you want to use for your study. So I encourage you to like just explore different methods. Like I think for us, we use a mix at Stampede. We use a mixture of Miro. We use the sticky notes, and we like, you know, use those to make notes. And then we also use spreadsheets because the table is quite easy to process, which I'll show you in a bit. So the next bit is about synthesis, or crunching, as we like to call it at Stampede. So there are many ways to synthesize research data. This is certainly just one of many ways, and I'm not saying at all that everyone should do this. I'm just giving an example. But the main thing that you need to know is you need to be able to process your notes quickly in order to get insights quickly, because what you're looking for, no matter what method you use, are the themes and patterns across different elements of your study. And learning how to categorize and group them will help you begin seeing this pattern. And that's why how you take your notes is important, because it can determine how quickly you synthesize your notes. So like I said, one simple way of doing this is using a table. So in this case, using the example of a user interview or a usability test, you know, you have your bunch of questions here, and you have, you know, Bob, Jane, and Sally, I guess, and they all say like slightly different versions of the same thing. And your synthesis would be when you're, you know, looking across these responses, you can look at the finding. You can formulate your findings here, and then for your design team, maybe you can write down some recommendations if you're familiar with the standards. So this one way, I'm sure there are many others, but I find this way quite easy. Yeah. Is empathy mapping a thing? Yes, it is a thing. I'm not sure I can have time to like cover the whole thing now, but you should definitely look it up. Yeah. Maybe we can cover it later. Okay, sharing findings and recommendations. So now we're going to talk about a little bit about sharing findings and recommendations. Once you've done all your research and your synthesis, you then have to compile, obviously, all your findings and recommendations into an easy to understand format. Whether it's a slide or a doc, it doesn't matter so much the format, but the main thing is to communicate clearly the outcomes of your study. You know, and this really highlight the insights that answer your research goals and that can help your team to shape the product strategy. And that way, I think you can show the value of research, and kind of it also giving this value also is a way of advocating for the use of user research within a company. And that's usually that's the most powerful way to advocate for teams to adopt user research. Yeah, that's what I think. And usually it does work because people are impressed by seeing like the recordings or the quotes or the insights that they weren't expecting. And that's when it really clicks for a lot of people. So yeah, when you have your findings and recommendations, you should deliver them as soon as possible, also after you've done your research. If you wait too long, it can grow stale. It may become less useful if like the feature, by the time you prepare your like 100-page report, they've already moved on to a new feature, and then your research is no longer valid. So don't do that. Just try to get it out as quickly as possible. So one way to do that is preparing a quick list of findings immediately after your research, like a summary, and you can send it out over Slack or email, and then you send them the follow-up masterpiece report later. And that can help more people to engage with your results more quickly in a more informal manner. So yeah, that is how I would do it. You're sharing the findings. And that brings us to the end of what I think are the main UX research basic things to do and components that you need to cover or learn about if you're on your own. So to recap, before I bow out, so UX research is the study of user behaviors, needs, and motivations. Understanding the user equals building better products, because then you can build the right product instead of, refining something that doesn't work. And the research basics that we covered today were preparing a research plan, knowing some basic research methods to get you going, knowing how to recruit participants, doing your trial run for your study, conducting the research itself in an empathetic, professional, and active manner, taking the good notes so you don't have to like regret later when you're crunching and you're like, no, it's so difficult. And then actually synthesizing your notes so that you can get the insights that you want that will drive your product strategy. And then sharing the findings and recommendations so your team can make the changes that are necessary or deliver ideas that will help improve the overall product experience. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed that session, and I hope you have an idea of how to get started with UX research. So yeah, this is me. You can reach me on Twitter, LinkedIn, it's just Mabel Tan. And thank you. Let me know if you have questions.
All right. Once again, thank you, Mabel, for that awesome talk.
Thank you. Can I stop sharing? Yeah.
Yep, sure. You can stop sharing. So before we jump into the Q&A, I want to actually say a few words about the talk as well. It reminds me of being a researcher in in the beginning of my career. Right now, I don't do much. Most probably will, yeah, in the very near term. So definitely the part that actually resonated me the most is actually a note-taking part. And that is actually really, really important. So for you guys who have been doing user research, but it's always been interviewing and listening, but not note-taking. Note-taking is actually I would say the most important part, because that's actually like a history list of what's been when you are interviewing users, and it acts as a lot of like if you like forget something and then you want to check back up, you're definitely your guide there. So if you want to get started with a user interview, that's always this few elements. Is that choosing users, interviewing it, and then also note taking it. But I'll leave the questions for you guys. Now, Mabel has been answering questions throughout the talk as well, so I'm glad we have a lot of time. Yeah. Now, I've also note down a few questions that you haven't answered yet. Maybe you have answered, but you can actually provide a little bit more. So who answered, because I note it down separately on my notes. So if you know who you are, then yeah. All right, the first question is actually for Mabel, is how to promote user research throughout the organization. I guess this is organization might be like a startup, new startup, or big organization. Do you have a simple method that allows the buy-in or easy consumption on the rest of the team?
easy consumption, like them getting on board, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's like getting on board from like the stakeholders team inside the company.
Yeah, I've definitely been in that position before, like in previous places where I work, where you're like the one person who's like, let's do UX research, and they're like, I don't have time for you. I think one of the easiest ways is to just say, because you can really start with almost no budget. In fact, I had no budget to start with UX research in my previous company. You just tell them, well, you don't just, there's no just, I don't want to prescribe too much, but I think one of the best ways is to show the value of user research. And that's how you can, continue to get more buy-in and more budget later on. If you're just alone, if you're just one person, I understand it can be quite challenging because you have your other responsibilities maybe. But I would say just start something small, just one question that the company can't answer without UX research, and start small, maybe do a small study and try to spend some time and get some findings from that, and then present that if it's impactful to the business. And when your organization sees that it's impactful to the business, then they'll be like, oh, I see why this person wants to do UX research. It's not just for the sake of talking to 5 people or 10 people. It's actually to bring value to the product or business. So that's how I would go about it. And I think it works, unless like they're very stubborn. But I think often with a little bit of discussion, most people can come on board. Just need to give them a bit of time. Yeah.
All right. I hope you guys actually got it. So if you still have a lot of time, if you have any extra questions, you can still leave it down the chat. So for the second one is how detailed do I, as a UX researcher, to observe the user? Maybe you can share.
Oh, sorry. Can you repeat?
All right. The question is, I noticed that. So the question is actually like, how detailed do I actually have to observe the user while I'm interviewing? Like, can you share a few examples? Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So being detailed is also a matter of preparation. That's something I learned at Stampede as well, which is like, if and your questions are kind of broad and random, right? Then being detailed becomes very tiring because you're always zooming in from like really far away. You're like, you want to, but you're asking about a whole like phone application usage experience. And when you're zooming down from, it's gonna be hard to be detailed because you're gonna be tired. They're gonna be tired. To be detailed, you go into your session prepared and focused. You have your research goal. I want to find out about this button. I mean, not this button, maybe like this experience. And you format your questions. So each section of questions covers exactly maybe the research question or topic that you're interested in, so that when you go detailed, you're not coming from here, zooming in, you're coming from here, and you can, still the specificity that you want. Yeah. Scope your questions to what you want to find out. That's how I would say you can get detailed without getting tired. Yeah.
Yep. So in summary is that scope it down, but also before you scope it down, you also need to be prepared. All the things that write on a note, like an interview sheet, like what you need to do beforehand, so that you know what's missing, just in case. Third questions will be, it's about choosing interviewees. It's actually, other than close friends or friends, where do you guys also reach out to users? Is it very common to directly reach out to existing users by phone call or email?
Oh, other than close friends, or I think definitely reach out to existing users in this case. I think close friends or friends, you could reach out to them for your pilot or maybe your portfolio study. If your close friends fit the persona, why not? But if they don't, then I think you you shouldn't rely on your close friends too much as a source of participants. If you have a pool of users, that's great. That's exactly who you want to serve, right? If you're conducting a user research about your product. And yes, it is definitely difficult to recruit by cold email or cold call. Usually there's some networking involved. You do need to kind of over time build a repository of people you can contact. I know something, I don't know how big your company is. If it's a small company and your users are not that many, maybe you can reach them directly. Maybe they're part of a Facebook group that your company runs where you can speak to them and say, hey, we're doing a study, incentive 50 ringgit or something, 100 ringgit. And you can get people to sign up and you can see whether they fit your criteria. And then you can choose people who fit your criteria. Don't choose anyone, just choose people who fit your criteria. If you're a big company, I know what Monzo does is that they keep track of people who send them support, like complaints, and they keep them they like put them in their forum system. They're like part of the community, and that's how they recruit. So there are many strategies for recruiting. Close friends are one option, but would keep those for very specific cases. Yeah.
All right. Thanks, Mabel. So I think there are a few more questions here. I'll save for another two. So the second last would be like, how do I rephrase this? All right. So this is most probably after changes have been made to a certain digital product or an app. Does it gonna take another pilot test again or directly conduct the real research? Well, I guess the pilot test is a real research.
Okay, so I guess if correct me if I'm wrong, you said, okay, you did one set of research, you changed the product, then now do I have to do the same pilot and research again? Is that what the question is? Something like that.
The question wasn't that clear. Like, okay, let me rephrase the question. It might be a little bit different, but to those who will be asking this one, yeah, right. So I think that's basically what Mabel said, right? After let's imagine that you have a product and you have has been launched, you've tested it, and then after the testing, you've made changes from the test. Right now, what happens next? Yeah.
Right. Okay. So, so I think definitely you still have to pilot and then do your research, because if you've changed your product, then maybe the questions change, then maybe the circumstances change. If it's a usability test, your questions definitely change because the screens change, right? So then you would do a pilot and then you do the full research. Yeah. Pilot is just a test run. It doesn't have to be so like a scary thing. It's just it's just to make sure everything is in order. And so I think it's a good practice to do it. Yeah.
All right. I hope this is your question to those who had asked.
Yeah.
I forgot who asked. All right. Last few questions. There are more questions coming in. We're ending. No. All right. All right. All right. This is a question from Java. 2 minutes ago. As a UX researcher, is there a template or a document that you rely on for your research?
A template or a document that I rely on for research. I think the only template that I frequently refer to is the research plan, because the research plan is kind of like, for me anyway, it's like a checklist of things I need to make sure I have to conduct the research. There's no template. I mean, template is an interesting word. I have templates for notes, but there's no template for the whole study, because if as a user researcher, as you go along and as you have more complex studies that you want to conduct, you have to design your research to fit the the problem or to fit the question that you want answered. So the main template would be the research plan. Yeah, that's what I would say.
Right. We'll accept one question. So I'll need to pick from 3. Okay, I'll pick this question from Shada. So it's basically tips for designers who are interested to specialize into UX research or user research. Yeah.
Okay, tips. Pick Zoe, Shaza said.
Then we'll move on to Zoe next.
Okay, got you. And they're more pointy fingers, so I'll go to Zoe's then. Tips, you can Google them. Don't worry about it. A lot of YouTube tips videos. Okay, how flexible? I'm just. Oh, sorry. I'm gonna just read the question, or you can read the question.
Yeah. I'll just read the question. So okay, for those who is confused, who's confused what's going on. For tips, right? Usually, you can actually search it a lot from YouTube channels or actually Medium profiles. And if you are still really curious on what kind of videos or Medium profiles, do keep tabs on our Twitter account. I'll post some examples from there, from Mabel's recommendation if you really need that clarification later on. Okay, so we move on to our last question, which is from Zoe. So Zoe asks, how flexible should you be in the testing or interview session? When does it make sense to go off script?
Good question. Again, I sound like a broken record. Again, it comes down to the methodology that you're using and the plan that you set out to answer your research goal. So I think in this case, she's referring specifically to more like user interview type studies, right? You can have a structured interview or you can have a semi-structured interview. And I think, or you can have a completely unstructured interview. So I'll just explain a bit when that happens. When you have a completely unstructured interview, it's more when you're at the very, very, very beginning of an exploratory phase. You're just gonna like, yeah, tell me about your life, go. And I think that's usually more in studies that are not in a commercial setting. It's more like research and ethnographic studies that will study the culture of the people or something like that. In a commercial setting, you're more likely to go for a structured or semi-structured interview. Semi-structured is very like fixed, like when, I don't know, maybe you're in a government kind of human survey where like, how old are you? Blah. Where do you live? Blah. And that's really structured. And I think what Zoe is referring to is more of like a semi-structured interview where you have, like I mentioned earlier, your goals that you want to achieve during the research session. You have your question. Each section of question, it answers a different part of your research question. When it makes sense to go off script is you've asked your question during the session and the user speaks about something and they've mentioned something that you didn't quite cover, but it's related to what you want to find out. And it's not listed in the question. You're never going to write a question like, ask when he says this, because you don't know what he's going to say, right? In that instant is when it's cool to go off script. Like that's when your curiosity and active listening is really important. Your curiosity should take you to a place where you ask the user, oh, why is that? What is that experience behind what you're telling me? So that's when it's appropriate to go off script. Yeah.
All right. I hope that I think that's all for all the questions and Q&A. Unfortunately, we can't cover every question. We have some time limit, but if you want that the questions to be asked, you can actually DM in the Kuala Lumpur to get that answered if you guys are still interested.